Obese girl sold like cattle. Mountain man bought her and said, "Your body is so stunning." "Name your price, Wheeler," barked the rancher. "How much for the fat one?" Laughter tore through the crowd gathered in the muddy yard behind Elk Creek Saloon. Leilani Wheeler stood trembling beside a broken wagon, her face flushed and eyes full of silent terror. Her father, Jim Wheeler, a man with whiskey for breath and debt in his veins, raised his bottle in one hand and shouted, "She's healthy, strong, and eats less than she looks. Who'll take her off my hands?" Coins clinked, men jeered. "Maybe sell her by the pound," someone yelled. The laughter that followed was cruel, sharp as frost. Leilani's heart hammered in her chest. The world spun. Every pair of eyes stripped her dignity away, one mocking glance at a time. Her father's voice slurred, "$10. She'll cook, clean, whatever you want." And then, through the cruel noise, came a silence, heavy, sudden, electric. A tall figure stepped forward from the shadows of the barn. Broad shoulders, long coat, hair dusted with snow. His voice cut through the cold like a blade. "I'll take her." The crowd turned. Someone whispered, "Bennett Boone." Even the drunkest men went still. Boone was a name people said in low tones. The reclusive mountain man from the high ridge, the one who lived alone after the war. A man no one dared cross. He tossed a handful of gold coins at Wheeler's boots. "That covers your debt," he said. Then, without another glance at the crowd, he shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over Leilani's shoulders. "She's mine now," he said, his tone calm but unshakable. "And her body is stunning. Not one of you deserves to look at her again." The crowd went silent. Leilani gasped, not from fear this time, but disbelief. For the first time in her life, someone had called her beautiful. The wind bit sharp that morning, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and stale beer from Elk Creek's single street. Leilani Wheeler stumbled through the slush, her father's drunken laughter still echoing in her ears. The world around her was gray, the kind of gray that seeps into the bones and stays there. She wasn't used to silence. Usually, there was always someone whispering about her when she passed through town. Too fat to marry. Such a shame, pretty face like that. No man wants a woman who can't fit on a saddle. Every word had been a bruise, but today was worse. Today, she wasn't a woman at all, just a debt to be sold. Her new owner, Bennett Boone, said nothing as he walked ahead of her through the snow. His long coat swung heavily with each step, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. He was taller than any man she'd ever seen. Shoulders wide, hands like carved oak, face half hidden beneath a rough beard and a shadowed hat. The townsfolk called him the Bear of Iron Ridge, said he'd killed 3 men in a brawl, said he'd lived with wolves, said he had scars that ran deeper than the mountains themselves. But when Leilani stumbled and the hem of her dress caught on the ice, he turned without hesitation. His hand, large, warm, and gentle, caught her elbow before she fell. "Easy," he murmured. That one word carried no mockery, no pity, only care. They reached his wagon, a sturdy thing hitched to a chestnut mare. He helped her climb in, then wrapped a blanket around her legs. "You'll freeze in that dress," he said. "Your father should be shot for bringing you out here like that." Leilani tried to speak, but her throat burned. "Why did you buy me?" she finally managed, voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Boone looked at her then, really looked, not the way men in town did, not with hunger or disgust, but with something quieter, something searching. "I saw enough," he said. "You stood there and didn't beg. That takes strength. I don't buy people, Leilani. I save them." She blinked. "Save me?" He turned back to the reins. "You'll understand when the mountain air clears your head." The road to Iron Ridge twisted upward, lined with pine and ice, each mile further from the cruelty of town. Leilani's hands, still trembling, clutched the heavy coat he'd given her, his scent of wood smoke and steel clinging to the fabric. Behind them, Elk Creek shrank into a smudge of lights, and the jeers that had haunted her faded into the howl of the wind. But as she looked ahead, toward the ridge that pierced the clouds, toward the cabin that waited unseen, a flicker of something strange stirred in her chest. Not fear, not shame, hope. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being looked at as a burden. She was being seen. And though she didn't yet know it, the man who'd bought her freedom had just bought back his own heart as well. The trail to Iron Ridge was narrow, cut deep into the mountainside where the pines grew thick and heavy with snow. The wheels of the wagon groaned as they climbed, the horse's breath rising in soft clouds that vanished into the bitter air. Leilani sat wrapped in Bennett's wool coat, staring at the wild world unfolding around her. Every turn revealed a new expanse of frozen forest, a silver river winding through the valley below, and cliffs jagged like broken glass above. It was beautiful, but lonely, like the heart of a man who'd given up on kindness. For hours, Bennett said nothing. He drove with calm precision, eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Only once did he glance at her, when the wagon jolted and she gasped. "You hungry?" he asked gruffly. She hesitated, unsure if it was a real question. "A little." Without another word, Bennett stopped the wagon near a fallen pine, reached into the back, and handed her a tin cup of soup, still warm from a small stove he'd packed. Leilani stared at it, astonished. You made this?" He nodded. "I don't starve guests." "I'm not a guest," she said softly. You bought me." He looked at her then, his gray eyes fierce. "No, I paid to stop that bastard from selling you to someone worse. You owe me nothing, not your work, not your body. Understand?" The words hit her harder than the wind. She nodded, fighting the sting in her eyes. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not with respect, not with conviction. When night fell, Bennett led the wagon into a clearing. He built a small fire with the ease of a man who'd done it 1,000 times, and the light painted his face in shades of gold and shadow. His hands moved with quiet skill, steady, controlled, as though every motion mattered. "Get some rest," he said, spreading a thick blanket on a bed of pine boughs. "You'll need it for the climb tomorrow." Leilani hesitated. "Where will you sleep?" He pointed to the wagon. "There." Her cheeks warmed. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted, tone firm but not unkind. "I'm not the man they think I am, Leilani. I won't give them reason to say otherwise." That night, the mountains sang. The distant cry of wolves, the whisper of trees, the crackle of fire. Leilani lay awake for hours, listening to Bennett's steady breathing from the wagon. She thought about his words, about how he'd looked at her, not as a purchase, not as pity, but as a person. When dawn came, the snow had stopped. The sky glowed pink over the ridge. Bennett packed up the camp, his movements quiet and efficient. As they climbed higher, the path grew steeper, but so did her courage. She began to help, clearing branches, leading the horse, even laughing once when she slipped into a snowbank and he pulled her out with one arm. "You're lighter than you think," he said with a grin. Leilani blushed. "You don't have to lie to make me feel better." He looked her straight in the eyes. "I don't lie." By the time they reached his cabin, a sturdy log home nestled between two cliffs, the sun was sinking behind the mountains. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the soft glow of lamplight spilled through the window. "This is home," Bennett said simply. "It's not much, but it keeps the wind out." Leilani stepped inside, and warmth flooded over her. The scent of cedar and smoke, the shelves lined with hand-forged tools, the small table set for two, everything spoke of a man who lived alone but still cared for the details of living. "You built all this yourself?" she asked in awe. He nodded. "Everything except the piano. My wife used to play." Silence fell. Leilani didn't know what to say, but her heart ached for him. That night, as the storm returned and the wind howled against the cabin walls, Bennett stoked the fire higher and handed her a bowl of stew. "Eat," he said. "You'll need strength here." She smiled faintly. "I already feel stronger." And as the firelight flickered between them, melting the shadows that had ruled both their hearts, Leilani realized something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't afraid anymore. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, quiet, steady, almost sacred in its simplicity. Life on the mountain was not easy, but it was honest. The mornings began before sunrise, when Bennett would split logs outside while the sky still wore the last bruises of night. Inside, Leilani learned to light the stove, boil water, and prepare breakfast from whatever they had: salt pork, beans, and sometimes venison. At first, she fumbled with everything. The kettle was too heavy, the fire too fierce, the cold too sharp. But Bennett never raised his voice. When she burned the bread, he simply said, "We'll try again tomorrow." When she slipped carrying a bucket of water, he caught her before she fell and murmured, "Easy now, the mountain's not going anywhere." Each act of patience was a revelation to her. Men in the town had only ever mocked her size, her clumsiness, her voice. But Bennett spoke to her as if she were capable of anything, as if her worth was never in question. One morning, as she stood at the window brushing her hair, Bennett paused behind her. His reflection appeared beside hers in the fogged glass. A tall, broad man, his beard flecked with snow, his eyes soft with something unspoken. "You look good like that," he said quietly. "Like you belong here." Leilani's hands froze. "You don't have to say that." "I don't say anything I don't mean," he replied. And then he left, his boots thudding across the porch, leaving her heart pounding harder than any hammer in his forge. She began to notice the small things about him, the way he hummed under his breath while working, the way his hands moved with precision and care when shaping metal, the way he always made sure her plate was full before he took his own. One afternoon, she decided to surprise him. She cleaned the entire cabin, scrubbed the wooden floor until it shone, and used the last bit of flour to bake biscuits. When Bennett came home, covered in soot and snow, he stopped at the door, staring in disbelief. "What's all this?" "Dinner," she said, smiling nervously, "and maybe a thank you." He looked around, taking in the spotless cabin and the smell of warm bread. "No one's done this for me in years," he said softly. "Not since—" He stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence. Leilani stepped closer. "Since your wife?" He nodded. His eyes darkened with a memory too painful to voice. "She and our little girl died when fever swept through the valley. After that, I figured I'd live alone till I was buried up here." She touched his hand gently. "I'm sorry, Bennett." He looked down at their joined hands, hers small and soft, his rough and scarred. "You've got no reason to be. You brought life back into this place." That night, the silence between them was warm, not heavy. The fire crackled, the snow fell in soft sheets outside, and something fragile yet unbreakable began to grow between them. Days turned into weeks. Leilani grew stronger, surer. She chopped firewood, tended the chickens, and even learned to shoe horses under Bennett's watchful eye. He watched her, pride flickering across his face each time she mastered something new. One evening, while repairing a fence together, she stumbled on a loose stone and fell hard against him. He steadied her by the waist, their faces inches apart. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, breathless. I think so." His eyes lingered on her lips for a moment too long. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Let's finish this before dark." But that night, as Leilani lay awake in her bed, she could still feel the heat of his hands on her skin. Winter deepened. The snow rose high against the cabin walls, and the two of them spent more time indoors. They worked side by side, she mending clothes while he forged tools by the fire. When she sang softly to herself, Bennett would pause, listening with an expression she couldn't read. "Keep singing," he said once. "The mountain feels less lonely when you do." One night, after a storm nearly tore the roof off the cabin, they sat together by the fire, wrapped in blankets. Leilani's hands trembled as she passed him a mug of tea. "Do you ever regret buying me?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. Bennett looked at her long and hard, his gaze steady as stone. "Regret?" he repeated. "Not once. The moment I saw you, I knew you didn't belong in that filth. You're strong, you're kind, and your body—" He hesitated, eyes flicking to her face. "Your body is stunning, Leilani. Not because of how it looks, because it's yours, because it carries a soul that refuses to break." Her eyes filled with tears. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Then they've all been blind," he said simply. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, two hearts beat in perfect rhythm beneath the flickering light. By the time spring began to whisper through the pines, Leilani had stopped thinking of the cabin as his home. It was theirs, a place of safety, of healing, of second chances. And somewhere between the snow and the sunlight, love had quietly taken root, waiting for the moment to bloom. Spring arrived late in the mountains that year. The snow melted slowly, feeding streams that ran silver through the valley. Leilani and Bennett spent their days repairing fences, planting a small garden, and preparing for the thaw that would bring traders and travelers back to Elk Creek. But peace on the mountain is always short-lived. One morning, as Leilani was sweeping the porch, she noticed a weathered leather satchel wedged beneath the steps. It was old, the kind of thing a man might hide and forget. Inside, wrapped in brittle paper, she found several folded documents stamped with the seal of the Union Pacific Railroad. Her hands trembled as she read the faded ink. Survey maps, mineral rights, mountain spring water source legally deeded to the Wheeler family, her family. Leilani sank onto the porch, her breath catching. The maps confirmed what her father had once drunkenly ranted about, that her grandfather had owned the rights to the spring that supplied water to the entire Elk Valley. But there was more, a transfer document, half-signed, showing that her father had tried to sell those rights to a man named Thaddeus Crawford, the wealthiest and most corrupt landowner in the region. She knew Crawford's name. Everyone did. He was the kind of man who sent others to do his dirty work. A smiling face in town and a wolf behind closed doors. When Bennett returned from the forge, he found her sitting motionless, the papers spread around her like fallen leaves. "What's all this?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "My father tried to sell our family's water rights," she said, her voice shaking. "But the deed was never finished. These papers mean I'm still the rightful owner of Mountain Spring." Bennett studied the documents, his brow furrowing. "That spring feeds the whole valley. Crawford's been trying to buy it for years." "And my father was part of it," she whispered. "He didn't sell me to pay his debts. He sold me to get me out of the way." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Then he's not done yet." His words proved true within days. Riders began appearing near the cabin, rough men on black horses watching from the tree line. They left footprints, cigarette butts, and once a note nailed to the door. "That water doesn't belong to you. Sell it or we'll take it." Leilani's heart pounded as she handed the note to Bennett. "They're coming, aren't they?" He nodded grimly. "Crawford's men, and your father's likely with them." For the first time since the auction, fear returned. Not the fear of ridicule, but of losing everything she and Bennett had built. "We can't run," she said firmly. "This is our home now." Bennett looked at her, pride glinting in his storm-gray eyes. "Then we fight smart." They rode into town 2 days later, carrying the documents in a sealed pouch. The townsfolk still whispered when Leilani walked by, but fewer than before. Her back was straight, her chin high. She was no longer the girl who had been sold like cattle. At the marshal's office, they met with Marshal Dillard, a stern but fair man who respected Bennett despite his reclusive ways. Leilani spread the papers before him and explained everything. Dillard frowned. "These are legitimate documents. If what you're saying is true, that spring legally belongs to you." "Then protect it," Bennett said, "before Crawford decides to take it by force." But Crawford was already ahead of them. That night, while they were still in town, his men set fire to Bennett's forge. Flames devoured everything, tools, steel, and months of work. Leilani ran into the street, eyes wide with horror. Bennett caught her before she rushed into the blaze. "It's gone," he said quietly, the orange light flickering across his face. "Let it burn." Her father appeared the next morning at the sheriff's office, disheveled but defiant. "That water belongs to the Wheeler family," Jim Wheeler barked, "and I'm the head of it." Leilani turned to face him, her voice calm but cutting. "You sold your right to call yourself my father when you put me on that platform." Bennett stood beside her, silent but solid as stone. Marshal Dillard examined the deed and finally said, "The documents name Leilani Wheeler as the sole heir and owner of the Mountain Spring source. Crawford's claim is null. Any attempt to seize it will be treated as theft of federal property." Jim Wheeler's face turned gray. Crawford cursed under his breath. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Leilani exhaling, the sound of freedom reclaimed. But victory came at a cost. As they left the courthouse, Crawford's men followed them into the street, their hands near their holsters. Bennett stepped in front of Leilani, eyes cold as steel. "This ain't over," Crawford hissed. "No," Bennett said. "It's just beginning." The storm rolled in the same night Crawford made his threat. Clouds swallowed the moon, and thunder cracked across the valley like the sound of judgment coming down from heaven. Bennett knew that kind of night, the kind men used to kill and cover their sins. He checked the rifle, laid it across the table, and turned to Leilani. She was kneeling by the fire, packing the documents back into their leather pouch. Her hands trembled, but her eyes, steady, fierce, glowed like embers in the dim light. "They'll come tonight," he said quietly. "You need to stay inside, no matter what happens." Leilani shook her head. "No, I'm done hiding while others fight for me." Bennett crossed the room in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders. "If anything happens to you," she placed a hand over his, "then at least I'll die standing beside the man who taught me how to live." For a long moment they just stood there, the fire crackling between them. Then Bennett exhaled, nodding once. "All right then, together." The first gunshot came just after midnight. A window shattered. Bennett moved like lightning, pulling Leilani to the ground as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Outside, silhouettes flickered in the snow. Crawford's hired guns, faces hidden under bandanas. Bennett fired through the doorway, the rifle roaring thunder. One man fell, then another, but there were too many. Smoke and splinters filled the air. Leilani crawled toward the table, grabbing the pistol Bennett had forged weeks before, small, perfectly balanced. She'd watched him make it, never imagining she'd use it. Now, with her heart pounding and ears ringing, she aimed through the shattered window and pulled the trigger. The shot found its mark. Another man went down. Bennett looked back at her, pride and disbelief flashing in his eyes. "Good shot. Guess you taught me better than you thought," she said, reloading with shaking hands. When the smoke cleared, Crawford himself emerged from the tree line holding a torch. His voice carried over the wind. "You think you can keep what isn't yours, Boone? You think that fat girl's worth dying for?" Bennett stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised. "I don't think. I know." Crawford laughed, a dry, ugly sound, and hurled the torch toward the cabin. Flames leapt up the wall. In a heartbeat, Leilani ran past Bennett, grabbed a bucket, and began dousing the fire. A bullet whistled past her ear. Bennett returned fire, hitting Crawford in the shoulder. The man screamed, clutching his arm, then stumbled back into the darkness as his gang fled down the mountain. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the heavy rhythm of 2 hearts beating in unison. When it was over, Bennett found Leilani standing barefoot in the snow, her hair wild, her face streaked with ash. He walked to her, took her face in his hands, and whispered, "You could have been killed." "So could you," she breathed, her voice trembling, "but I wasn't going to let them burn our home." He smiled then, the first real smile she'd ever seen on him. "Our home," he repeated softly, and kissed her as the first light of dawn touched the mountain tops. The fire was out, the valley was safe, and for the first time in years, the mountain man's heart, scarred, silent, and starved for love, finally found peace. Morning came gently, like a mercy long delayed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a silence so deep it felt sacred. Snow covered the burnt edges of the cabin roof, softening every scar the night had left behind. Inside, the cabin glowed again, not with fire, but with life. Bennett sat by the hearth, his arm wrapped in bandages, watching Leilani move quietly about the room. She was humming, a sound so delicate It could almost make a man forget the world had ever been cruel. "You should rest," he murmured. "I will," she replied, placing a bowl of hot broth before him. "After you eat." He smiled faintly. "You're bossy for someone I rescued." Leilani turned to him, eyes shimmering with warmth. "You didn't rescue me, Bennett. You found me, when I didn't even know I was worth finding." He looked at her then, really looked, at the way her hands moved with quiet confidence, the way her laughter seemed to mend the cracks in the walls and in his heart. Outside, the creek that ran from Mountain Spring shimmered beneath the rising sun. The water, their water, flowed freely again, untouched by greed, as if the land itself was grateful. Bennett reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a brass ring he had forged from an old horseshoe the week before. He had never planned to give it to anyone, until now. "Leilani," he said softly, his voice rough as gravel, "I'm not much for words or promises, but if you'll have me, this mountain will be yours as much as it's mine." Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "It already is," she whispered. As the morning light spilled through the window, Bennett took her hand, and the mountain, for the first time in years, felt alive again. Every time stories like Leilani's are told, they remind us that love can rise from the coldest places, from shame, from fear, from the edges of the world where kindness feels extinct. Bennett didn't see a broken girl. He saw courage wrapped in scars. And that was enough to change everything. If you've ever felt unseen, unwanted, or unworthy, this story is for you. Wherever you're listening from in the world, remember, you deserve to be chosen, not for perfection, but for your heart. If you still believe in love, don't scroll away. The next story is waiting for you.